On the night of October 8, 1871, a Catholic priest named Peter Pernin stood in the street of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and watched the sky turn a color he had no word for. The town around him was built entirely of wood, its houses, its sidewalks, its church, even its streets, which had been packed for years with sawdust from the company mill until the ground itself would burn. The summer had left no rain behind it, only weeks of dry heat that turned the surrounding pine slash into standing kindling. Pernin had heard the roar before he saw the flame, a sound survivors would later compare to 100 trains crossing a bridge at once, and when the fire came it did not creep through the town the way a grass fire creeps. It arrived all at once, in a wall, and it drove Pernin and hundreds of others into the Peshtigo River, where they stood chin-deep in the current for hours, while the heat above the water blistered the skin of anyone who raised a hand too high. By morning the town was gone. Not damaged. Gone, down to the ground it stood on, and what the fire left where a company boarding house had stood was not ash and not char. It was a fitted stone floor no one in Peshtigo had ever built, in a town that owned no quarry and employed not a single mason. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The scale of what happened that night is documented well enough that the strangeness of the stone is easy to miss inside it. The fire crossed more than 1 million acres of Wisconsin and the Michigan side of the border in a single night, consuming 12 towns along with Peshtigo, and the death toll, uncertain because so many of the dead left no one behind to report them missing, is placed by most estimates between 1,200 and 2,500 people. It remains the deadliest wildfire in the recorded history of the country, and almost no one outside Wisconsin has heard of it, because on the same night Chicago burned too. That fire took the headlines, the relief funds, and the historical memory, while the fire that killed perhaps 10 times as many people 250 miles north was reported briefly, then filed away. Survivors who made it back into the ruins in the days after describe details that read now like an inventory of impossible heat. Sand along the riverbank fused into blistered glass. Iron tools left in a blacksmith's yard came away from the ground half melted, pooled at the edges like something poured rather than forged. Pernin himself wrote of balls of fire dropping from a sky that had turned, in his words, a shade of blue he associated with nothing he had ever seen burn. None of that, on its own, breaks the physics of a firestorm violent enough to generate its own wind. Extreme heat does strange things to sand and iron. What does not fit inside an ordinary firestorm, however hot, is a floor of dressed stone standing clean at the center of all that ruin, unmarked by the fire that melted the metal 6 feet away from it. The man who found it was not looking for anything strange. His name was Micah Colfax, and he arrived in Peshtigo 3 weeks after the fire on behalf of the Chicago office that had built the town in the first place. Peshtigo belonged in 1871 almost entirely to the Peshtigo Company, a sawmill and woodenware operation owned by William B. Ogden, the same Ogden who had been the first mayor of Chicago and who lost his own city home to the fire the same night his Wisconsin investment burned to the waterline. Colfax's job was actuarial rather than historical, sent to walk the wreckage, list what could be salvaged, and put a figure on what the company had lost, building by building, so a claim could be filed and a rebuilding budget set. He carried a notebook for exactly that purpose, and most of its pages record what a claims surveyor records: foundation dimensions, the count of mill machinery destroyed, the board feet of lumber lost in the yard. At the site of the company boarding house, a long frame structure that had housed unmarried mill workers before the fire took it, Colfax's notebook changes register. Beneath the collapsed timber and the drift of ash, where he expected to find the building's foundation, a rough course of fieldstone stacked and mortared the way every foundation in a lumber town was built, at speed and on a budget, he found instead a floor of dressed stone, cut square, fitted edge to edge without mortar at all, running back further than the boarding house's footprint had ever extended. The blocks were pale and close-grained, and Colfax, who had grown up around the quarries of northern Illinois before he took up survey work, wrote that he did not recognize the stone as anything cut locally, and that Peshtigo, so far as he knew, had no quarry of its own to have produced it. The company's own business directory, drawn up 2 years earlier for insurance purposes, listed every trade working in the town that year: sawyers, millwrights, blacksmiths, a cooper, 2 carpenters who also did rough masonry for chimney bases. Not one mason, not one stonecutter. A town that built everything, including its streets, out of wood and sawdust, had, somewhere beneath one of its buildings, a floor cut and fitted with a precision its own trade rolls could not account for. Colfax noted one more detail before moving on to the next line item, the kind of detail a claims surveyor records out of habit rather than interest. Around the exposed floor there was no debris from its own construction, no chips of waste stone, no broken tools, no offcuts of the kind that gather around any quarrying or dressing work, ancient or otherwise. Whoever had cut and fitted that floor had left the ground around it as clean as the floor itself, the way a site looks when it has been finished and cleared rather than abandoned mid-work, and Colfax's notebook records the absence in 3 lines before returning, without comment, to the board footage lost in the adjacent yard. What struck Colfax more than the fit of the stone was its condition. Every other surface in the ruined boarding house footprint carried the same signature the whole town carried that autumn: a black scorch driven into whatever hadn't simply burned away, the fieldstone chimney bases cracked and sooted, the iron stove fittings warped from heat that had, by every account, run hot enough to fuse sand into glass a few hundred yards away. The dressed floor Colfax uncovered showed none of it. He wrote that he ran his hand across 3 separate sections of it, expecting the char that covered everything else in the wreckage, and found the stone cool, pale, and clean, as though the fire that had leveled a town and killed more than 1,000 people in a single night had gone around it, rather than over it. He took a chip from a broken corner, the kind of sample a careful surveyor takes when he doesn't trust his own report to be believed later, and kept it. That chip is the only physical trace of the floor that exists today outside Colfax's own notebook, because the company's need to rebuild was more urgent than anyone's need to understand what he had found. The record of what happened to the discovery is not a record of investigation. It is a record of speed. Ogden's company was in no position to pause over a curiosity in the fall of 1871. The fire had destroyed the mill that employed most of the town, killed a significant share of its workforce, and put the company's entire Wisconsin holding at risk, and the surviving management pushed to rebuild on the same footprint before winter closed the roads and the workers who remained scattered elsewhere. Colfax's report went into the company's file. The boarding house foundation was covered again within the year under an ordinary poured base, and no further survey was ever commissioned. The town's own records from before the fire, its land plats, its birth and property registers, the company ledgers that might have shown whether anyone had noted the stone before, burned along with everything else that October night. What survives of Peshtigo's documented history before the fire survives almost entirely in copies held somewhere else, which means the absence of any prior mention of the floor proves nothing except that the one record that could have settled the question is itself among the missing. The floor surfaces again, decades later, in an entirely different kind of record. In the 1910s, the Wisconsin State Historical Society ran a project to collect first-hand reminiscences from the fire's aging survivors before the last of them died, and among the volunteers gathering those accounts was a folklore collector named Edith Marsh. Marsh's assignment was ordinary oral history work, dates, family names, routes people had taken to the river, but her surviving correspondence shows she kept encountering, from at least 3 unrelated informants who had lived through the fire as children, an unprompted mention of a stone floor found where the company boarding house had stood, described by one witness as looking older than the town itself. Marsh drafted a short paper proposing to follow the thread, requesting access to whatever remained of the company's rebuilding records, and then abandoned it. Her later published work turned entirely toward Wisconsin dialect and hymn traditions, a respectable but unrelated field, and nothing in her correspondence explains the shift. The draft paper survives in the Society's uncatalogued folklore files. The follow-up she proposed to write does not exist anywhere. None of this, examined piece by piece, forces a conclusion. A surveyor could misjudge a stone's age. A researcher can change subjects for reasons private enough to leave no trace in a letter. What the Peshtigo case shares with other fires that have stripped ground bare is not one dramatic find but a repeating shape, where fire, rather than creating anything, only removes what had been sitting on top of something else the whole time. It happened twice more, in places with no connection to Wisconsin, and institutional attention arrived, looked briefly, and moved on the same way Colfax's company did. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In the summer of 1988, wildfires burned through more than a third of Yellowstone National Park, an area covered for over a century by dense lodgepole pine and the thick mat of needle duff beneath it. When archaeologists went in behind the fire crews to assess known sites, they found something no one had planned for. With the duff and undergrowth burned away, the exposed ground revealed obsidian flakes, tool-working debris, and stone features never before recorded, at a rate far higher than ordinary survey in that same forest had ever turned up. The fire had not created any of it. It had only burned off the layer that kept it hidden, the same layer that had kept it hidden for as long as the forest had stood there. In the summer of 2018, a severe drought scorched the fields of Wales down to bare browned ground, and aerial photographs that August showed the outlines of features no survey had ever mapped, the ghost footprint of a hill fort, and nearby, a ceremonial enclosure archaeologists had not known to look for, visible only because the drought and the fires that followed had stripped the covering vegetation down to nothing. In both cases, in Wyoming and in Wales, the pattern was the same. What surfaced had already been there, unrecorded, and in both cases, once the press interest passed, formal follow-up survey moved slowly enough that most of it went uncovered again before anyone could complete a full study. Peshtigo's stone floor fits the same shape, only compressed into a single catastrophic night instead of a season of drought. The fire that killed more than 1,000 people did what the Yellowstone fire did to the duff, and what the Welsh drought did to the grass. It stripped away, in hours, a covering that had stood undisturbed since before the Peshtigo company ever cut its first tree, and it exposed, for the few weeks before the rebuilding covered it again, a piece of construction the town's own trade records cannot explain. The difference is that Yellowstone and Wales left their exposures to archaeologists with funding and time. Peshtigo left its exposure to an insurance surveyor with 3 weeks and a claims form to fill out, and by the time anyone with the training to ask the right questions heard about it second-hand, in Edith Marsh's files 40 years later, the ground had already been rebuilt on twice. What the stone requires, if Colfax's notebook and his chip of sample stone are taken at their word, is a structure already standing beneath the ground the Peshtigo company chose for its boarding house, before the company ever arrived to choose it. The lumbermen who built the town in the 1850s and 60s were not builders in stone. They floated logs, they cut boards, they packed their streets with sawdust because sawdust was free and stone was not worth quarrying for a town that expected to log itself out of existence within a generation anyway. Nothing about the Peshtigo company's own history, its own methods, its own workforce, produced a fitted stone floor without mortar. The floor was there before the company was. Under timber the company felled, and streets the company paved with mill waste, waiting for a fire hot enough to burn through everything built on top of it and reveal, for a season, what it had been covering the whole time. The town of Peshtigo rebuilt itself within 2 years, on the same grid, over the same ground, and stands there today, home to a small museum dedicated to the fire, its display cases holding melted glass, a warped church bell, and the personal effects that survived the night in the river with the people who carried them. The museum holds no stone floor because the floor was never recovered. It was built over, first within the year by the company's own crew, and again decades later when the boarding house site was redeveloped a second time, and whatever remains of it now sits beneath a building whose owners have no reason to know a fire once uncovered something under their foundation that the town itself never built. The one piece of it that did survive is the chip Colfax took from a broken corner before the crew reburied the site, and it survived only because he never turned it in with his report. Company men who spend their careers writing figures for other men to approve learn, some of them, to keep the one detail that does not fit for themselves, and Colfax kept his sample the rest of his life, first as a curiosity on a shelf, and later, after his death, as an unlabeled stone in a box of his effects that passed through 3 generations of his family before anyone thought to ask what it was. It is with them still, a pale, close-grained fragment, small enough to hold in one hand, cut on 2 faces with the same precision Colfax described in his notebook, and rough on the others where it broke free of whatever it had been fitted against. No laboratory has tested it. It exists the same way the Yellowstone quarry sites and the Welsh hill fort outlines existed for however long they sat hidden, real, physical, and waiting for something to strip away whatever stood in front of it. There is an easy way to close the question, and it has been reached for at every point along this record. The stone was an old chimney footing no one bothered to log. Colfax misjudged the cut in poor light 3 weeks after a catastrophe that would leave any surveyor rattled. Marsh's informants, children at the time of the fire, remembered a mundane foundation as something grander with the years. Each explanation is possible taken alone. None of them accounts for why a lumber town with no masons in its trade rolls, and no quarry within reach, would have produced a foundation that outperformed every technique its own carpenters were documented to know, or why that foundation came through the hottest fire in the recorded history of the American wilderness, without the scorch that marked every other stone surface in town. I am not arguing that a fire proves a lost civilization sat beneath a Wisconsin lumber town, or that every unexplained foundation hides more than a builder's shortcut nobody wrote down. Careful doubt belongs in a case built this far from a courtroom. What deserves attention is the consistency across a river town in Kentucky, a pasture in Texas, a forest in Wyoming, a field in Wales, and a burned company town on the Wisconsin side of Green Bay, of the same sequence. Something buried is exposed by a force violent enough to strip away centuries of ordinary cover. Someone with no reason to lie writes down what they saw, and then the discipline that could have followed up moves on before anyone does. Colfax filed his figures and went back to Chicago. The company rebuilt because a town without work is a town that dies twice. Marsh turned to hymns and dialect and left her draft in a folder nobody catalogued. Each decision, on its own, was reasonable. Together they are the reason no one has stood over that stone with proper instruments in 155 years. Peter Pernin stood chin-deep in the Peshtigo River on the night of October 8, 1871, and watched his town disappear into a firestorm hot enough to melt iron and fuse sand into glass. And he lived to write down what he saw, because the water covered him the way the sawdust streets and timber walls never could. What the same fire uncovered on dry ground, a few hundred yards from where he stood, was a floor built by hands the company records cannot name, in a stone the town never quarried, fitted with a precision the trade rolls of 1871 cannot explain, and it survived heat that consumed almost everything else in Peshtigo because it was never built to burn in the first place. It is down there still, under a rebuilt town that has no reason to look for it, waiting the way it waited before the fire came, for the next thing violent enough to strip the cover away again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.